Hey, welcome to Practical Witch Talk. I'm Friday Gladheart, and I'm your host. Today we're going to be talking about drying herbs, harvesting, and making some tinctures. As the nights are starting to cool off, we feel autumn in the air, and it is definitely something the plants are feeling as well as they come to the end, many of them anyway, come to the end of their life cycles, or at least the seasonal cycle. It's a great time while these plants are at their peak potency to harvest things such as rosemary, sage, even elderberries are ripe now in some areas, wormwood, mugwort, that kind of thing. And in this week's almanac for 2024, there's instructions on how to make herb bundles, smaller ones than, say, the sage bundles that you find at most of the New Age stores. These smaller bundles are better for apartments and for small spaces. Large herb bundles that we are traditionally seen at bookstores and, well, all over, even Walmart, sadly. These were originally created for outdoor use or for use in pretty well-ventilated areas. They really aren't that functional for modern use. It's great. It feels very magical to be waving a wand around, but if you read the instructions, you can make these same bundles with just 3 or 5 stems of an herb, and it's going to give you a much better smoke output, a much better burn. It's going to be more consistent, and it's going to be less of a fire hazard. Many of you may use a shell underneath your bundle of herbs to catch sparks and ashes. I use my cauldron for this, and I put a little bit of sand in it. So when I'm finished with an herb bundle, and there's a lot left of it, but the smoke is plenty, I will just tip it over into that sand to extinguish it. So I really prefer my cauldron. I'm not following a traditional smudging ceremony. I'm not Native American, so I don't need the abalone shell and all the accoutrements that go along with that ritual. If you're using 3 to 5 stems, it's going to give you a better burn, and it's going to drop a lot fewer sparks and ash. But I think something you might want to give a shot is to make your own hand-rolled incense. Sage is really good for this because if you look closely at the leaves, they're kind of fuzzy. These little hairs, we're going to call them hairs, these little hairs will help bond it to itself. That's why when you buy sage in the grocery store, a lot of times it's not ground or powdered sage. It'll be called rubbed sage because the leaves are kind of just scrubbed across a screen until the bits of it disintegrate, but it kind of clumps together because of those hairs. And those can make it so you can make a really effective, amazing incense without having to use binders and fillers and flame accelerants and all the different things that go into a more nuanced incense. What I like to do is I will take a standard bundle of, let's say, sage or rosemary. I'll undo all the strings and then take all of the nicest leaves off of the stems, off the sticks. And you can use those sticks for other crafts and projects if you want. But I take those leaves and I grind them very, very, very fine in a blade coffee grinder. Now, you could use your pestle and mortar, and actually that is very similar to the rubbing, but I am lazy and practical. So I'm not really lazy. I just have a whole lot of projects I like to do, and practicality is number one. So I will definitely use a blade grinder. When it's in the grinder, sometimes I'll add maybe a half teaspoon to the whole bundle, a half teaspoon of cinnamon. And if you've ever gotten cinnamon powder wet, you'll notice it makes this mucilagous substance, which is really, really good for you, actually, internally when you're eating it. But it also helps bind that incense stick together. And the cinnamon is very traditional on altars throughout Western occultism for blessing, for purification, protection. It's been used for summoning. It's a major ingredient in most of the classic incenses. Several formulas of the Abramelin incense also contain cinnamon. So I use it as kind of a way to give a little oomph to the incense, while, of course, respecting the practicality of it. It makes it so it sticks together better. So you're grinding all of your herb bundle up. And then I sift mine through a sieve, just a mesh sieve. You can get very precise sieves for this, like a double aught, a single aught, or numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. But I find just the normal kitchen sieve is fine for this, because we're doing some pretty coarse sticks here. They're just going to burn more consistently than a bundle. They're going to put out more consistent smoke They're not going to be as much of a fire hazard with the flare-ups and sparks and dropping flaming ashes. It's the domesticated and indoor version of an herb bundle. After you've ground everything up, put on your favorite streaming service, get settled in to be piddling around with a bunch of muck on your hands, and slowly, very slowly add just a little bit of water and keep stirring and blending it in until it starts to create kind of a crumbly texture similar to oatmeal, like coarse oatmeal. Instead of water, you can also use other things such as a strong herbal infusion or a tincture. Sometimes people, traditionally, many recipes call for wine, and I think that's great. The alcohol and the acidity of it help to free up a lot of the aromatic components, but because of the sugars in it, it has this kind of burning sugar smell, which is great in an outdoor cistern next to the Nile in the West, burning all these great things with wine and raisins, except that I don't really like the smell of burning cookies, so I skip the wine and use only liquids that are sugar-free in my combinations. Even if I want that energy of honey, I will sometimes use something called honey absolute, which is a natural derivative of beeswax. Anyway, boy, I do get distracted. I hope you guys like my rambling ways. You can follow my train of thought through all the mountains and valleys. Once you have it to this crumbly oatmeal texture, very, very slowly just drip a few more drops of water in until you can kind of collect some together into a bundle. And you can pinch it between your 3 fingers and your thumb and try to make kind of a cone. Or you can try to roll it into sticks. Now, because we're not using any binders, fillers, it may crumble and disintegrate. What I would highly recommend is making short sticks that are about as big around as a pencil and a little bit shorter than the average crayon. So you're making these little dupes. You don't have to put a stick inside them. You don't need to roll this around a stick for incense. These sticks can be waved around just like an herb bundle, but they can also be set inside your cauldron in sand, just like a stick incense. As far as harvesting and drying, I think there are some really good tips that I was able to squeeze into the almanac about using your car as a dehydrator or using your vehicle as a dehydrator by lining the back seat with a white sheet or whatever clean sheet you have and straining the herbs across of that. But I do have to tell you, I have been pulled over while doing this, and I often wonder what these officers think. Like the whole car smells like mullein or mugwort or catnip or wormwood or whatever it is I'm drying, and it always gives me this kind of side eye, and I totally understand. I mean, it looks pretty sus, but obviously the plans in the back are not anything illicit. And also, I usually do this when I'm at home and the car's going to be parked in one spot for a while. And I crack the windows, but I don't have a lot of neighbors that are going to pass by and see a bunch of herbs that reek up the parking lot. So use your common sense and wisdom about how much contact with other people, asking questions you want while doing this. I also like to, when I'm harvesting catnip, I'll often put it out on a clean white cloth on top of a large industrial cookie sheet, a full sheet pan. I don't know if you've worked in a restaurant, but they're I don't know, 2 feet by 3 feet. Anyway, I'll set the catnip, just the premium buds, onto this white towel, and I will let it sit in direct sunlight for about an hour or 2 until they're wilted. I've noticed that this helps to continue, well, not only does it dry them out a little bit before I get them into dehydration situations, but it tends to let the flowers open the rest of the way if they haven't quite bloomed. It just kind of, they use the sugars and the energy they have already accumulated to kind of finish up their process. It also tends to make the oils come to the surface really nicely. Then I take them to shade into kind of a lightly warm, dark, well-ventilated area. When I'm making tinctures, I very much prefer to use dried herbs over fresh herbs. And it can be very, very convenient to use fresh herbs, but drying them or even wilting them in the sun a little bit to reduce that moisture content will keep your tinctures from becoming contaminated. One of the first things you learn when you're making any kind of herbal concoction is that when oil and water meet, that's where microbes breed. Plants are very high in oil contents, especially herbs. That's what we're kind of after in most of them. There are other constituents that aren't oil soluble, hence tincture. If we wanted just the essential oils, we'd get essential oils, but tinctures are going to give you a more holistic product. It's the essence of the plant in many ways. So are essential oils, but tinctures are going to give you a lot of those water soluble and acidically soluble constituents. And sometimes those can be really valuable. An example of that is salicylic acid that's found in willow bark and some other plants. And that's the pain relieving, the anti-inflammatory, not very oil soluble. You're going to want to use a water, alcohol, or acid tincture. My basic tincture formula is I take a bottle of Everclear that is about 90 to 95% pure food grade ethyl alcohol, and into that I'll put about 2 tablespoons of pure citric acid. I've used ascorbic acid in the past because I thought it could also give a little bit more preservative, but actually the citric acid extracts better and it lasts longer. Vitamin C, ascorbic acid is so easily destroyed by sunlight and heat, and citric acid is just a lot more shelf stable. I combine that alcohol with the citric acid, shake it all up until it's dissolved, and I'll use that as the base for my tinctures for fresh herbs. When I'm using dried herbs, I don't need that strong alcohol content to preserve the moisture content in those herbs. For dried herbs, I like to use a softer alcohol, such as a vodka or a nice clear rum, very unflavored. And one way to get rid of the top notes, let's say you've got some great gin, or maybe some cheap gin that came in a plastic bottle and hey, it was cheap. If you go to the aquarium store and get charcoal mats, they are like a mesh or a foam that's infused with charcoal, and you put it into a long tube or I actually use the glass cylinder that came on a candle holder. It's just a straight glass cylinder and it would go over a pillar candle. I will pack that full of this charcoal foam, and then I pour the flavored, like the gin has juniper berries and whatnot, or rum might have some allspice. I'll pour the flavored alcohol through this charcoal filter over and over and over until there's no more color, until I don't smell any other flavorings. And sometimes I'll taste it, which I'm not a huge alcohol fan, but I'll taste it and I'll see if I can sense any other herbs or any other flavorings. So that charcoal will pull out a whole lot of the contaminants. Well, they're not really contaminants, but for our purposes, they're going to kind of get in the way. So to this filtered vodka or whatever alcohol you've decided to use, it must be food grade. Do not use rubbing alcohol. I simply pack bottles full of fresh herbs and then pour this alcohol and citric acid mixture over them until they're just barely covered. I'll shake it up really well, set it in a dark, cool place, not in the sun. We talked about that with the ointments. In a dark, cool place for a couple of days. It depends on the herb. If I'm using rosemary, that's usually pretty well spent in a 3-day period. If I'm doing something like cinnamon bark, though, it's going to sit in there a couple of weeks. It takes a long time for that to get into the bark and extract it. You could even go a month or even 6 months on cloves and cinnamon and those hard botanicals, barks and roots. Sassafras is very similar. Now, let's say you're using dried herbs and you want to do the same thing, but maybe you don't want to buy Everclear or you can't find it available. You're going to get, like I said, vodka or rum. But if you could get Everclear, you can go ahead and add some extra moisture to this. Now, you have essentially about a 90% alcohol solution. You only need about 40% to prevent microbial growth in your tincture while it's extracting. You can always dilute your tinctures later. So I'm going to just run through 2 examples. One is for fresh herbs, one is for dried herbs. The fresh herbs, like I said before, we had it rosemary. We're going to go back to the rosemary example. We had it packed in there for 3 days. I'm going to pour it out into a colander that I've lined with a flour sack towel. Now, you can use several layers of cheesecloth. I prefer a flour sack towel because it doesn't catch so much of the herbs, and it collects less of the actual tincture because that dry fabric is going to absorb some of it. I don't want that. Sometimes I will pre-wet the cloth that I'm filtering through or pre-wet the filter medium. I'll usually use a purified distilled water or spring water for this, just so that it's not absorbing all the extra moisture out of the tincture. Some commercial filters that are meant for spin filters, centrifugal filters. They can work really well, but they take a long time if you don't have a centrifuge. You can also use coffee filters, and you don't usually need to pre-moisten those. If you are going to use coffee filters, please don't use the bleached ones. They have dioxins in them they're harmful to the environment, that can contribute to certain kinds of cancers in the body. So just use unbleached filters, or like a nice flour sack towel. Anyway, I'm pouring out the tincture through the flour sack towel, letting it rest in the colander. Sometimes I'll put a rubber band around the colander to make sure it doesn't sink in there. To the nice, beautiful, usually jeweled green tincture that's left over, I'll wring out that flour sack towel really, really hard. Squeeze out all the juice I can. Then I'll set those herbs aside. We can talk about that at a later time, but I might use those for other things, especially paper making, by the way. Anyway, then I will repack the jar with new fresh herbs and use the tincture I just filtered and pour it down over the new herb. This is a double extraction. I'm going to let that sit for 2 or 3 days, shaking it up consistently, restrain, rinse and repeat. Basically, you're going to do this until your tincture is so saturated. You might even see some oils beginning to float on the top. It may become very dark brown, dark black, so dark green it looks black, that kind of thing. And as long as your alcohol content is remaining high, it's going to stay really well preserved. Now let's go to a dry herb example. Because the dry herbs are going to absorb a lot of the moisture of the alcohol, I would go ahead and use anything above a 40%. You can take your citric acid and Everclear mixture and dilute it about 50%, or you can just get an 80 proof alcohol at the store. That's going to be 40% alcohol. So like Everclear is, I think, 180 proof. So it's basically 90% alcohol. Some brands can go up to 95% alcohol. So anyway, you get the picture. Proof is just double the percentage for ease of understanding. Pack your jar full of the dried herbs. For this, because they're dry, I'll not just cover them with the alcohol citric acid solution. I will go another maybe an inch or up to a finger joint above those herbs, because they are going to expand as they get moist. The next day when I go to shake it or stir it, I'll check to make sure they're all immersed. And if they're not, I'll keep adding more alcohol until they are. Here again, you do the same thing. You're going to filter it, squeeze out any excess tincture. You can use the tincture as is. That's an excellent tincture. Or if you need something a little more intense, you can go ahead and pack more dry herbs in and pour the filtered tincture over it and do it again. You can also, instead of using a liquor, you can use wine for this. For a wine, I strongly recommend getting one with a very high percentage of alcohol and maybe even souping that up. A lot of your Cabernets, your Merlots are going to be in the 15% alcohol range, but you can look for whites and reds and even rosés that are a little higher. If I'm using wine, a lot of times it's because the end tincture is actually going to be a ritual beverage. For example, let's say you're on a budget, you get a good bottle of, I don't know, like a Apothic Red, because it's fun, it's got a great bottle, and it's decent. It's not going to break the bank. And you want to kind of soup it up for the holidays. And we're going into Maybon, so this is going to be something that's really popular. And mulled wine is actually just kind of a tincture. Into the bottle, I'm lazy. I often do this right in the bottle. I'll take the cork out, and I'll just drop in a cinnamon stick and a couple of cloves, and I'll loosely put the cork back on there and let it sit for a couple days before the ritual. That's not exactly ideal. I'm telling you, that's really not ideal. So what I really like to do is I will extract a few herbs, and I'm really fond of doing this with sage and wormwood. And I'll extract just a few of them, let's say maybe a small handful. These are very, very strong herbs that impart a pretty bitter flavor. Wormwood obviously is used in absinthe, which can be, without the sugar and the lotion can be extremely bitter. They try to offset it with licorice and anise and all kinds of flavorings, like basil even, but it's a bitter herb. It's the standard by which herbalists say something is bitter. Is it as bitter as wormwood or more bitter than wormwood? Not much is more bitter than wormwood in the herbalist's cupboard. I'll do a small tincture in my Everclear citric acid solution, or just Everclear. And I'll maybe make a 1/4 cup of this tincture, and I'll add it back to the wine, like fortifying it. For that, when I'm using like wormwood and mugwort, I'm going to usually select a white wine, a Gewürztraminer, a Chardonnay, something pretty light, and one that doesn't have a lot of flavors on its own, that I'm just trying to kind of bump that bright grape flavor. But use your own taste, use your own budget. The red wines, I think, lend themselves really well to the spicier botanicals, allspice, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, etc. When you're using these in mulled wine, you want to keep that clarity of the wine really nice and bright. So avoid using any powdered herbs. You're going to want to use whole botanicals. They can take a while to mull in the wine. I don't like to heat the wine because I want to preserve the flavors that are already in it and the flavors and the alcohol content. Heating it will reduce that somewhat. Obviously, you're not going to boil it. I do cold extractions for ritual beverages, and it may take a couple of days in the refrigerator. If it's going to take more than 4 days, I don't like to have a bottle of wine open in the fridge that long. So I'll do an extraction or in a tincture first and then add the tincture to the wine. If I'm just preparing for a ritual that's going to be later in the evening, it can just be a couple of fresh herbs put into the bottle of wine beforehand. And actually, I discovered this in the 80s. And some of you Gen Xers might remember this. Remember Boone's Farm Strawberry Hill? I screwed off the cap. Yep, screw cap. That's what we're talking here. And I stuck in just 2 or 3, I think 3, because I was into the magic of 3, of course, still am. I put 3 fresh tip leaves of sage, just regular garden sage, into the wine, screwed cap back on. And sage does have a lot of very interesting chemicals to it. But I did not expect... There were 3 of us at the ritual that night. It was maybe 8 or 10 hours later after classes out in the woods. I felt incredible. I was able to see the magic better. I was able to read the tarot cards better. It was really interesting. So even though this is like super cheap college kid budget ritual beverage, it was really quite astounding. So experiment around with your budget and what you have on hand. You don't have to go out of your way to get a whole bunch of stuff. And a lot of times if you go to the liquor store, you can get a really small bottle of Everclear. Remember, that's like 90, or I think it's called Clear Out or Clearview. It's all owned by the same company, but they're the only ones that make this 180 proof alcohol. But it's sold under different brand names in different states. And every time I move, I have to figure out the new brand name. And I can't remember what it is here now that I'm in Arkansas. It's Everclear up in Colorado and Nebraska and Montana. And it's, I can't remember what it's in California now. It's been too long. Anyway, take a look at the liquor store and talk to your store owner about what you're doing. I find building a relationship with them can be really helpful, especially towards the gift-giving holidays, such as Yule, when I'm looking for a small, what we call airplane bottles of different liqueurs. I like to make truffles, so I'll need just a tiny amount of Grand Marnier. And as I've said before, I'm really not that into alcohol, so the last time I had my favorite Irish whiskey, it was a very expensive bottle, but it lasted for like 15 years because I had like one drink on my birthday. I'm just really not that into it. So having little airplane bottles is really great if you're using them for foods, flavoring, magic. You can put them right on the shelf with the essential oil. It's really fun. Let's see if there's anything else. I think I mentioned some of this in the almanac on tinctures. On this, the example in the almanac is very specific, and it's using dried plant material. Now, next week, we're going to talk about Lunasad, Lammas, whatever you want to call it. We're going to talk about some of the harvest rituals going on. And remember, although this is a specific Sabbath, it's a greater Sabbath, according to modern Wiccans, it doesn't just, it's not, I think we have too much of a tendency to put all of our eggs in one basket. Like, we're building up to this event, and then we have this post-event letdown, like it's going to be after the honeymoon. Lammas, the Sabbath has begun. I felt it in the air. There's been a shift in the evening. My surprise lilies are blooming. That's usually my sign. They're right around my altar, and it's usually my sign that the witching hour is nigh. You know what I mean? We're getting into that pumpkin spice weather. Just about. And this is the perfect time for the harvesting all of your bounty in your life. Not just the plants and herbs in your garden or on your windowsill, but taking a look at all the different things you've done this year so far, all the progress you've made. It's not a time to necessarily analyze what you need to work on. That's what winter is for. That's what the dark season is for. Right now, it's about celebrating the wins. Just celebrate your wins this season and start now. Because it's not just Lunasad Eve or Lunasa Eve on Wednesday the 31st and then Lammas on Thursday the 1st. It's now. It's going on now. Also, on Monday, the 29th, you might get a glimpse, now that we're into the waning moon, you might get a glimpse of the Delta Aquarid meteor shower. And if you're out at night, it's a good time to be looking up. This has been a production of Practical Witch in cooperation with witchacademy.org. If you'd like more information about tarot, herbs, and witchcraft, consider joining witchacademy.org. Blessed be.